Can you picture a man who is genuinely into the woman he's dating? Shows up consistently, texts back, makes plans. By every visible measure, things are going well. And yet, somewhere underneath all of that, there's a quiet current of something he can't quite name, a low hum of unease that has nothing to do with whether he likes her and everything to do with what liking her is starting to cost him internally. She hasn't done anything wrong. The relationship isn't in trouble, but something in him is already bracing. This is the part of male psychology that almost never makes it into conversation, not because men are emotionally unavailable by nature, but because most men don't have the language for what's actually happening inside them when they're developing real feelings for someone. They know something feels heavy. They know there are moments where they pull back slightly without a clear reason. They know that certain things she does, certain qualities she has, certain dynamics between them trigger something that doesn't feel entirely comfortable. But naming it, sitting with it long enough to understand it, that's where most men go quiet. What we're talking about today aren't surface-level insecurities or the kind of fears that show up in bad relationships. These are the quieter ones. The ones that live inside genuinely interested men who are trying to figure out if what they're building with her is safe enough to keep building. The fears that don't get announced, they get acted out. In subtle distance, in deflection, in behavior that looks confusing from the outside, but makes complete psychological sense once you understand what's driving it underneath. Because when a man is afraid of something real, he rarely says so. He just starts moving differently. 1. The fear that she'll emotionally outgrow him. There's a particular kind of discomfort a man feels when he's sitting across from a woman who is clearly, undeniably more emotionally articulate than he is. She can name what she's feeling in real time. She understands her patterns. She's done the work, therapy, self-reflection, the kind of honest internal excavation that produces a person who knows herself well and isn't afraid to say so. And he's sitting there, genuinely drawn to all of it, while something quieter and less flattering is also running in the background. Something that sounds a lot like, what happens when she realizes I can't match this? This fear doesn't announce itself as insecurity. That would require a level of self-awareness that the fear itself is evidence he hasn't fully developed yet. Instead, it shows up sideways. He makes a slightly dismissive comment about something emotional she said, not because he disagrees, but because the alternative is admitting it went over his head, and that admission feels dangerous. He redirects conversations that get too psychologically deep, not rudely, just smoothly, the way someone changes a subject when they sense they're about to be exposed. He finds small moments to assert his perspective a little more forcefully than the situation requires, because somewhere in him, dominance feels like a reasonable substitute for depth when depth isn't yet available to him. The ego is doing what the ego does in moments of perceived inadequacy. It inflates outward to compensate for what feels hollow inside. And the target of that inflation, unfortunately, is usually the woman whose growth triggered the fear in the first place. This is why emotionally evolved women sometimes find that the men most drawn to them are also the ones who occasionally, inexplicably, seem to want to dim them just slightly. It isn't malice. It's a man whose self-concept is bumping up against its own ceiling, and the friction is coming out sideways. What makes this fear particularly stubborn is that it's self-reinforcing. The more she grows, the more inadequate he feels, the more he pulls back emotionally or subtly undermines, the less safe she feels to be fully herself around him, which creates distance, which he then interprets as confirmation that something is wrong between them, without ever identifying himself as the source of the tension. The cycle runs quietly for a long time before either person can see it clearly. And by the time it usually surfaces as a relationship problem rather than what it actually is. One person's unresolved fear of being left behind by someone they deeply admire. 2. The fear that her feelings are bigger than his. There's a specific moment in early dating where a man suddenly becomes aware that she might be more invested than he is. Maybe she said something that revealed the depth of what she's feeling before he's arrived at the same place. Maybe her consistency, her warmth, the way she shows up without being asked, all of it starts to quietly outpace where he currently is emotionally. And instead of that landing as something flattering, something in him tightens. Not because her feelings aren't welcome, but because now there's a weight attached to this thing that wasn't there before, and he can feel it. This fear is one of the most misread dynamics in early relationships because from the outside it looks exactly like lost interest. He was warm, then he got slightly distant. He was initiating, then he started responding more than reaching out. She's trying to figure out what changed, running back through recent conversations looking for the moment she said the wrong thing, and the painful irony is that she probably didn't say anything wrong. What changed is that he felt the emotional imbalance, and his nervous system responded to it the way it responds to most things that feel like exposure, by creating distance to restore a sense of control. The psychology underneath this is tied directly to attachment. A man with even a moderate avoidant lean, and a significant number of men carry this without a clinical label anywhere near them, experiences emotional asymmetry as a threat rather than a gift. When she wants him more than he's currently able to want her back, it doesn't feel like an opportunity. It feels like a debt he didn't agree to take on. Like there's now an expectation sitting in the room that he isn't sure he can meet, and the gap between what she feels and what he feels starts to read as pressure rather than connection. So he creates space. Not to hurt her, to breathe. What's particularly complicated about this fear is the internal contradiction it produces in him. Because he does like her. That part is real. But the version of this where her feelings are significantly bigger than his puts him in a position he finds psychologically uncomfortable, one where he holds more power in the dynamic than he asked for, and where the possibility of eventually disappointing her feels almost inevitable. Some men respond to that discomfort by leaning in and trying to close the emotional gap. But a lot of men, particularly those whose nervous systems learned early that emotional closeness comes with unpredictable costs, respond by quietly stepping back and waiting to see if the feeling levels out on its own. It rarely looks like fear from where she's standing. It looks like he's losing interest. But what's actually happening is that he's afraid of what fully gaining it might eventually require him to give. 3. The fear that who she is now will change. There's a version of this fear that lives in almost every man who has been through at least one relationship that started beautifully and ended in a place he didn't see coming. Where the woman he fell for, the one who was easygoing, secure, independent, low drama, gradually became someone whose behavior he didn't recognize once the relationship became official and comfort set in. He's not making that up. That shift is real, it happens, and it leaves a specific kind of residue. A hypervigilance that he carries quietly into the next thing, scanning for early warning signs of a transformation he isn't sure he can survive again. So when things are going well with her, genuinely well, the kind of well that starts to feel like something real, a part of him is also quietly waiting for the other shoe. Not because he thinks she's performing, not because he doesn't trust her specifically, but because his past has taught him that the early version of a person and the settled version of a person can be two significantly different experiences, and the transition between them isn't always something you see coming until you're already in too deep to leave without real pain. His emotional investment is essentially a bet he's placing on a future version of her he hasn't met yet. And that uncertainty, for a man who's been burned by it before, doesn't feel romantic. It feels like risk. This is the fear that quietly drives a lot of commitment hesitation that gets mislabeled as immaturity or avoidance. He isn't necessarily afraid of commitment in the abstract. He's afraid of committing to a dynamic that might not survive contact with reality. The easy laughter, the lack of neediness, the way she never makes him feel managed or monitored, he loves all of it. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a voice that sounds a lot like experience is asking how much of this is her and how much of this is her dating behavior. Because those two things in his history have not always turned out to be the same. What this fear produces behaviorally is a man who seems to be moving in slow motion towards something she can see he wants. He's interested, but not quite fully in. He's warm, but leaving a small amount of space that never quite closes. He's testing the consistency of who she is across different contexts, stressed, disappointed, uncertain, inconvenienced, because those are the moments that show him something the good days can't. He isn't stalling for sport. He's trying to gather enough evidence that the woman in front of him now and the woman she'll be when the newness wears off are close enough to the same person that the leap feels survivable. That's not a character flaw. That's a man trying to protect something in himself that got damaged the last time he chose wrong, doing the only thing his nervous system knows how to do when hope and fear arrive in the same moment, moving carefully, watching closely, and waiting for something consistent enough to finally believe. Final conclusion: all three of these fears have one thing in common: none of them are really about you. They're about what he's carrying. The emotional gap he hasn't closed yet, the imbalance that makes him feel exposed, the past that taught him to brace before he believes. Understanding that doesn't mean absorbing his anxiety or shrinking yourself to make room for it. It means you stop taking personally the behavior that was never actually personal. A man working through real fear about a woman he genuinely wants looks a lot like confusion from the outside. But underneath it, if you know what to look for, it looks a lot like someone trying to find solid ground before they let themselves fully land. If this resonated with something you've been experiencing, tell me in the comments. I read everything and I do respond. Share this with someone navigating something similar, because the right information at the right time changes everything. And if you haven't subscribed yet, that button exists for a reason. This is the kind of content this community was built around, and I want you here for what's coming next.